Hi, this is Robert Holmes from Return Path. I'm one of the panelists on today's .bank webinar, hosted by Encirca and Craig Schwartz from FTLD. Craig, are you with us?
I'm with you, and it seems like there must be some technical difficulty right now.
Yeah, apologies to everyone. We'll be right with you once we've managed to connect with the person who's driving today's presentation. So, Andrew, if you're with us, if you could take us back to the top of the presentation and kick us off with an introduction. That's wonderful. So, Andrew, we're with you.
Hi, can you guys hear me now?
We can indeed. Thanks, Andrew.
Oh, I apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened earlier. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Migrating to .bank, a step-by-step roadmap for transferring to .bank. These will be our presenters today. First, we have FTLD Registry Managing Director Craig Schwartz, managing .bank and .insurance domain registries. He is former Chief Registry Liaison with ICANN. We also have Rob Holmes, General Manager for Return Path, responsible for email fraud protection services, previously leading in the DNS and brand protection service providers. And then finally, President of Encirca, Thomas Barrett. Encirca is the sole registrar serving on .bank Security Requirements Working Group. Encirca was founded in 2001 in Boston, Mass. So we will be going through the activation roadmap for .bank today. First step, obviously, is the .bank domain name registration. And then it goes forward to DNS hosting, and then website hosting and email hosting simultaneously, depending on how you want to roll out your .bank domain name. Then finally, marketing and threat monitoring. I'd like to remind you that if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the question box of your GoToWebinar widget. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Craig Schwartz on .bank by the numbers.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to Tom and Robert for bringing us this webinar, and of course to the ICDA for their ongoing support of the .bank registry. It's really great to have so many participants on the call today, and I presume that most of you have already registered a .bank domain name or perhaps more than one. But some information by the numbers through October 31st. As you can see here on the screen, had just a bit more than 5,000 domains registered by banks within the United States, representing about 2,500 individual banks. So it appears that banks are on average registering a couple of domain names. We know some only have registered one and others have registered many, which is how the average gets skewed a bit. We do have registrations from all 50 states, and as you can see, Texas, Missouri, and Mass are leading the way in terms of the highest volume. We will be ramping up our efforts abroad, specifically in Europe and the rest of the world after the first of the year, and we'll continue to do a big push too in the United States. When we look at the overall number of banks that are here, and depending on who you talk to, the number seems to be just a little bit more than 7,000. If we've got 2,500 participating, there are roughly another 4,500 that haven't yet. And so our goal is to touch as many of those folks, bring them into the .bank space. Next slide.
So now, thank you, Craig. We will discuss DNS hosting, the second step in the .bank activation roadmap. I'd like to hand this slide over to Tom Barrett.
Thank you, Andrew. So this step of the roadmap happens after your domain name has been validated by Symantec and most of you, I believe, are in that state currently. The first step is to activate DNS that is compliant with the .bank security standards. So that means a DNS server, for example, in Rockport.bank, they will be in it.
Hey, Tom, it's suddenly very difficult to hear you.
I'm sorry about that. You also need to have a digital certificate for your .bank, even if you plan to do web forwarding or even a park page. And DNSSEC is required and in fact enforced before your name can resolve on the internet. And just a note, that requires coordination both with your registrar and your DNS provider if you're not using them, using the same party for both of those functions in order to make sure your DNSSEC does work. So we do have some useful links here on the page where you can check your verification status if you're not sure if your name's been approved yet, and also check the status of your DNSSEC for your domain name. And those two links there, one is for the registry WHOIS, and one is for DNSSEC. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tom. Now, in regards to step 3, website and email hosting, you can do both of these simultaneously, or you can do one before the other, however you choose to roll out your .bank website. .bank domains must use SSL encryption, even for web forwarding. And Circa recommends an extended validation SSL certificate, but domain validation is also allowed. We recommend the extended validation simply so that you get the highest level of security on your website, and at the same time, an EV-cert allows for the green icon in a URL bar when you're visiting the page to let your visitors know that it is a trustworthy site. You can migrate your website and email independently or in parallel. Be sure your web server is using the allowed cipher suites, and Circa can assist you in letting you know which cipher suites are allowed and which are not allowed. Also, DMARC alignment is required for outgoing .bank emails. And regarding DMARC, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Holmes from Return Path.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So if you could, if you could click through the animations on this slide. Let's start with the end in mind. Why is DMARC relevant? What is it? Well, simply put, DMARC prevents people spoofing your email address. So rewind the clock to when the SMTP protocol was first published, and there was nothing in the SMTP protocol that was designed to guarantee security. And specifically, there was nothing in the SMTP protocol that prevented me from pretending to be you. So it would be very easy for me as a fraudster in this example to spoof an email address of secure-owens@firstcitizensonline.com, even though that is owned by First Citizens Bank. And I could send an email from that address, which would look very, very convincing and take somebody through to a very convincing phishing site, as per the example you can see. Only DMARC prevents that type of spoofing of email addresses. So DMARC, as Craig and his team at FTLD have designed a secure TLD that you are all going to benefit from and your customers are going to benefit from. DMARC really prevents fraud from happening in the email channel. It blocks phishing. So we're going to drill a little further down into that because I'm not going to get too technical, but Andrew, if you could take us through to the next slide. I'm just going to give you a few details of what it is. It's a bit of a mouthful. DMARC stands for domain-based message authentication. That's to say it's authenticating a message based on the domain name that it came from. It inspects the domain and it authenticates that it really came from that domain. And it also provides what we refer to as reporting and conformance. The reporting is great. The reporting is going to give you really great insights into what is going on both legitimate activity and fraudulent activity over your sending domains, over your emailing domains. The conformance, well, we won't go into too many details about that, but essentially it's a mechanism by which we can ensure that there's no spoofing. So don't think that this is a new protocol just for .bank. .bank is a real trailblazer in how they're implementing it. But actually it's been a protocol that was launched over 3.5 years ago and was pioneered by companies including Turnpath and Google, Bank of America, etc., etc. And currently already in place at many of the world's largest financial institutions. What .bank is doing, it's bringing that same level of kind of enterprise protection to the community banks world and other smaller and medium-sized banks. Fundamentally, DMARC provides you with two things. As an owner of a domain, it gives you control over what is allowed to be sent over those domains, and it also gives you intelligence. It enables you to see what is being sent. So if we take you through then to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about, okay, specifically now, as it relates to .bank, what do I have to do? What do I have to do to be compliant with FTLD's security requirements? Well, simply put, you need to implement DMARC, and you need to implement it in a way that prevents third parties from spoofing your sending identities. And I'm not going to read all of this. I'm going to focus on the first bullet and the last bullet. The first bullet says that registrants, yourselves, you must publish a valid DMARC record with a policy of either quarantine or reject. Now, what does that mean? First of all, a DMARC record is a DNS record. Tom's going to go into a few more details about DNS a little later. But simply put, you need to insert a DMARC record into your .bank DNS. And that record is going to inform Gmail and Yahoo and Outlook and any other mailbox provider that respects DMARC to do one of two things with email that fails DMARC. To either quarantine it, flag it as potentially fraudulent, or to reject it outright. So when I am Gmail and I receive an email that looks as though it's come from one of your sending domains, I will check that it passes the DMARC standard, and then I will either dismiss it or I'll put it in junk. So that's the first bullet. Now, one of the things you need to understand is that authentication-based standards are such that even legitimate email, if it fails authentication, will get blocked. So it's a little bit like a door policy on some exclusive club that you might own. If you turn up on the door of your own VIP lounge or what have you, and you don't have the necessary identification, you won't get in. Now that's very, very important on implementing DMARC. If you don't implement it correctly, you actually run the risk of blocking legitimate traffic or having the quarantine or reject policy applied to legitimate traffic. Now, FTLD and DMARC allow for that. So what you can do is, as well as publishing a DMARC record with a policy of quarantine or reject, there's a third policy that can be published. It's actually called none. The policy is called none. It might have been better called monitor. And during the implementation phase, FTLD.bank allows you to publish a DMARC policy of monitor only or none, so that you can tune up the authentication of your legitimate email so that it passes DMARC. That way you can be rest assured that legitimate email is not going to get blocked and that only fraudulent email gets blocked. So for a period of time you may use that interim policy, that monitor only policy. So let's bring it back to when we look at the next slide, just to remind ourselves as to why this is important and why this is invaluable. Without DMARC, if I receive an email from your domain, I would not be able to be guaranteed that it really came from you. And the fraudsters would benefit from that. So without DMARC, there is nothing that prevents fraudsters from spoofing your domains. DMARC ensures that only you can send from your domain. Okay, so I think if I'm right here, Andrew, the next slide is probably handing the baton back to another participant. So I'll go on mute.
Thanks, Rob. You are correct. I do have a quick question concerning DMARC. How is DMARC different than SPF?
Great question. An email is a little bit like well, very much like a piece of postal mail. Insofar as there are two elements of a postal mail. There's the message itself, but there's also an envelope. And the same can be said of email. There is the message that you see when you open your email, but then there are hidden elements of the email, the envelope, in which the email was actually kind of delivered, as it were. Now, SPF will validate, will authenticate the envelope address. So when you send an email, it goes into an envelope, and you sign it with an envelope from. It's actually called a return path address as well, not entirely coincidentally. And what SPF does is that it checks that envelope address, it checks that relative to that envelope address, the email came from an IP address that is allowed to send on behalf of that envelope address. Okay, so it checks that the envelope has come from a legitimate IP address that is allowed to send on behalf of that domain. But SPF does nothing with regards to the from address that appears in the message, in the header of the message. When you open it up, as per that First Citizens Online Bank example earlier, SPF does not authenticate that from. That from is an entirely different field in the email. So SPF is important to prevent spoofing of the envelope address, but only DMARC will prevent spoofing of the visible from, the one that your customers are going to see when they open your emails. Tom, hopefully that's sufficiently untechnical and enough information at this point in time.
Excellent. And as a quick follow-up, can certain parties be allowed to spoof email by utilizing a correctly configured SPF record?
So there are ways of, absolutely. I mean, look, the reality of it is that most companies are set up in such a way that third parties are sending on their behalf. So even at Return Path, we use marketing agencies, we use SaaS vendors, all of whom may legitimately send on our behalf. You can configure your authentication to allow that. The critical thing is that you are authenticating them as a sender on your behalf, whereas the third parties don't benefit from the same level of authentication.
Thank you, Rob. I hope you don't mind. I do have another question for you. How do you get or verify that legitimate email is properly authenticated?
Well, I could be biased and say use our tools, but that would be a little too obvious. So let's say Tom is actually going to kind of go into a few more details. You could do this yourself. The R, excuse me, the R of DMARC is reporting, and you can actually specify your own company to receive those reports, and you can then interpret those reports and make sure that your legitimate email is authenticating correctly. Or you can use third-party software, and we're a vendor of such software. So Tom's going to talk a little bit about that later. So back to you, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your answers. I'd like to remind everyone, please do enter all your questions into the question box of the GoToWebinar widget. There will be a copy of the slides and a recording of this presentation found online at encirca.com/bank. Now regarding step 4 in the bank activation roadmap, I'd like to hand it over to Tom Barrett. Tom?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Rob. So far we've talked about some fairly technical aspects of the roadmap in terms of setting up the DNS that's required for .bank, migrating your website and or your email, and making sure you're in DMARC alignment. I do want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the communications aspects of moving to .bank. So first, you have to make sure you articulate and understand what the marketing benefits are for You have to understand what the benefits are for .bank and communicate that to your internal stakeholders, such as employees and management and board, but also after that, eventually to your external stakeholders, such as your customers. And so the two main benefits that we see that I think certainly resonate with the end user, and as well as the bank organization, is that first of all, by achieving your email authentication and following all these other security standards, the bank will improve their deliverability of their emails they send out to their customers, because they're basically working in concert with all the major email providers such as Google, AOL, Microsoft, to ensure that their legitimate email gets delivered to their customers. At the same time, it will be blocking any spoofing or phishing attempts, and so they start to build trust in consumers that .bank is truly secure as compared to, say, a .com website. And so you do need to prepare your communications both internally and externally. The .bank registry has done a great job in developing a guide that has a lot of templates that you can take a look at that articulate these benefits and making sure you're preparing your stakeholders for your move to .bank. Next slide, please. Some other marketing considerations in terms of moving your website to .bank. First of all, we are recommending that you start building your search engine history as soon as possible for your .bank domain name. And even if you're not ready to migrate your website, you can do this by activating your domain name in the DNS and putting up a landing page similar to what Encirca is doing for its customers. And by doing that, the .bank domain name starts to resolve, starts to get indexed by the search engines, and that will help you with your rankings later when you migrate your full website. There is potentially a branding impact as well. Your logo, for example, may include .com in the logo, and so now it's becoming a .bank-based logo instead, and so that will require changes to your creative collateral. Obviously, your website. You may want to look at social media changes from going from .com to .bank, and obviously there's impacts on your signage, your letterhead, and business cards. And finally, on a technical level, when you do the migration, you can certainly redirect your .com over to your .bank. Just make sure you do that correctly, and so you can carry over the SEO benefits from your old website. And finally, we do recommend you also set up search engine analytics, if you haven't already, to capture the type of traffic you're getting into your website. Next slide, please. So step 5 is actually what we call threat intelligence. And so Rob's already talked quite a bit about how DMARC works and the steps required in order to get into DMARC alignment and make sure that you are in compliance with the security requirements for .bank, but also that you've secured your outbound email for .bank. But it's not a one-shot deal, and so on an ongoing basis, you'll want to continue to make sure that your email and your website is staying secure. So on the next slide, please, we talk about just 3 examples of possible threat vectors that you might experience on your website. No different than what you might experience today on .com. You need an ongoing program to monitor and prevent these types of attacks against your website or your email. And we'll go ahead to the next slide, because I know this question came up earlier when Rob was speaking. But in terms of ongoing threat intelligence for your email, there are several different ways you can accomplish this. And so this is something you can do yourself. And so we certainly can help you configure your DMARC policy so that the reports coming out from Google and AOL and Microsoft, they're in this format called XML, and we can actually send those to your IT department if you would like to analyze these reports on your own. And so we call that the do-it-yourself method of monitoring. That's certainly available, and we simply have to configure your DMARC record to an email address that you designate. The second option we call do-it-yourself with reporting service, and the idea behind this is that you can still somewhat do it yourself, but we're going to take that XML data, which is somewhat hard to digest and actually understand what's actionable, and format it into some easy to read reports that can be shared throughout the organization, and so that you can decide what steps you want to take if you find out some third party is spoofing you, or if in fact you're sending out legitimate email that is getting blocked. And then the third option, of course, is you can outsource all of that. So we can help you decide which of those options are right for you. We do believe that if you're not doing it already, then you should definitely take care of this for your doc site as well as your .bank website. And we're working with Return Path to help you there, but there are other providers out there as well. We'll put some useful links on this page so you can learn more about DMARC, find out what the current status is of your .bank or .com domain name. So for example, you can find out if you are using DMARC today on .com. You can find out if you are using SPF or DKIM, and you can check the status of that through these third-party tools that you can see on the screen here. Next slide, please. This last slide is a little more commercial in nature. We've talked about 5 steps in this roadmap, from registration to DNS hosting, to website and email hosting, to marketing, to threat monitoring and detection. And we want to let you know, of course, that we can help you in all of those steps. And we can help you with some other, we get a lot of requests, for example, from folks who want to consolidate their .com name and .bank name in one place, or they want to consolidate the DNS hosting for their domain names. We can help you in those areas as well. Next slide, please. So I'll hand this back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tom. That will conclude our webinar. We'll get to your questions in just a moment. I'd like to remind you that this webinar has been recorded. A copy of the slides and the recording can be found at encirca.com/bank shortly after the webinar. We will also email all attendees a link to where the slides can be found. Encirca is offering free consultations for all 5 steps of the .bank roadmap that you've seen today. To learn more, please visit encirca.com/bank. All general inquiries and callback requests can be scheduled. All you have to do is email .bank@encirca.com. Now I'd like to go to the Q&A box, and we'll start off with a bank that has external business relationships. For example, online banking hosted, e-statements hosted by third parties. How do they handle when users navigate to a hosted .com online banking solution that is not allowed to register a .bank?
So Tom, do you want me to take the first pass at that one?
Yeah, well, yeah. I know you want to talk about the core processor piece.
Yeah, that's what this one sounds like. So for banks that do rely on third-party services, for example, from core processors, we do enable core processors to register domain names in .bank specifically so they can continue to provide the types of services they provide to you now. It could be that they run those services on their own domain names, or it could be that they run one off of your .bank domain. So if you've registered, for example, best.bank and you use a service provider, it may be that they use the URL service provider.best.bank for the provisioning of those services. So we do permit that type of activity, and in fact it's absolutely necessary, and we understand it's critical for your business. But we do mandate that it be done within the .bank space and not on URLs or domain names from other TLDs such as .com.
And Craig, you might want to talk a little bit about the ongoing monitoring that the registry does to make sure that the website, .bank website, is staying within the .bank zone.
Sure, happy to do that, Tom. So one of the requirements that we have, FTLD as the registry operator, is to monitor for compliance with all of the security requirements. So we have a vendor that does that for us. We get reports every day on every one of the security requirements and every one of the bank domains that are activated. And what I mean by activated is the DNSSEC piece is in place, as is the name server requirement. Because without those two initial components, a domain name can't resolve or can't be found on the internet. In terms of the other security requirements, such as the SSL piece, we do monitor to make sure that if you are standing up a .bank domain, that it is at an HTTPS site, and or if you're resolving or redirecting, at least initially, to a .com name, you still have to have your .bank domain SSL enabled before that redirection occurs. With regard to the DMARC component that Robert talked a great deal about, we do monitor to ensure that DMARC is in place for every domain name, regardless of the fact of whether the domain is being used for email or not. The policy is that if you're not using your domain name for email, you must set your policy at reject. And there are a couple of other different policies that you could set in the interim as you're getting more familiar with and comfortable with DMARC reporting. But we do, again, have a mechanism in place to monitor for that every day. I'm trying to think. The last one that comes to mind is what we call CNAMing, and that is aliasing a page on your website to somewhere other than within your banking infrastructure. And a great example, I think, of that is when I go to my bank's website and I click on I want to sign into my online banking feature. If that online banking feature is provided by a service provider and not the bank itself, banks typically alias to a URL for the service provider in order to have that service be offered to the customer. Again, and this is a comment that I made at the opening, aliasing is fine as long as you're aliasing to another .bank domain, which is why service providers can participate in the .bank domain internet extension. So we're looking at these activities every day. We have a director of compliance and policy who will send out a notice to you and or your registrar if something is out of compliance, and we'll obviously work with you to ensure that a remediation plan is in place and that anything that is not as it should be is made as it should be in a reasonable time frame.
Great, thank you, Craig. I do believe that answered the question. We do have two specific questions related to third-party service providers. First would be, can .bank domain be used with a DDoS mitigator, such as Cloudflare? If not, does .bank allow for any DDoS prevention mechanisms to be put into place?
So the short answer to that is yes. A bank can easily work with their DDoS mitigation service provider, whether it's Cloudflare or any one of the others, as long as the service being used and the domain name associated with that service is in compliance. So a company like Cloudflare could register cloudflare.bank for the specific provisioning of DDoS mitigation services to a banking customer. And we've had pretty extensive discussions with a number of cloud service providers to make sure that they are aware of their ability to participate in the .bank space. As we know, it's critical to a bank's threat mitigation and detection strategy. So I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer to yes, they can absolutely participate.
Excellent, thank you. And we have noticed a few banks are working with Office 365, and they are experiencing issues because Microsoft can only give a .com URL for the MX record. Is there a known workaround or fix to address this solution or problem?
Thanks, Andrew. And it's interesting. I just literally 2 days ago got an email from a core processor working with a bank, their banking customer, about this 365 issue. And I was not aware of that. We are looking into it right now. I can't say that there's a workaround available today because we just learned of the issue, but we are looking into it and figuring out what we might do to accommodate that limitation. So that's a to be continued conversation, and we will advise our registrars and more broadly stakeholders when we have a communication and a resolution on that.
Thank you. I'll make sure to follow up with the asker of the question here. Now, regarding, you mentioned aliasing .bank domains in the online banking provider using a .com domain alias. Is it possible for a .bank to have a pop-up window or a link redirecting to a .com URL?
So there's a difference, and this is Craig again, there's a difference between aliasing and redirecting. And so the latter, when I think of that on a website, you might host third-party content to, for example, a Twitter feed or a LinkedIn page or even a Facebook page. And it's perfectly permissible for a bank to serve up third-party content like those that I just mentioned. We do strongly recommend that the bank website have a pop-up box that says something along the lines of, "You're about to leave the so-and-so .bank website. We don't vouch for the security or privacy," or et cetera, of where you're going. Do you still want to continue? And most banks, I think, are doing that already. The distinction or the differentiation between redirecting to third-party content and aliasing to a service provider's product is that, at least from the standpoint of the customer or the internet user, when you're taken from one place to another and the URL in the browser bar doesn't change, which is typically what happens with aliasing, the user's not knowing that they're being taken from where they thought they were in .bank to actually some other place, likely in .com or .net. And so for the avoidance of confusion for customers and the misperception that they think they're still in the .bank zone when they're actually not, if they've been aliased to another URL, we prohibit aliasing or CNAMing or DNAMing for that explicit reason. So aliasing is fine as long as it's from bank to bank. It takes us back to the conversation or the discussion points already about service providers being able to secure their own .bank domains for the provisioning of those types of services. And as already stated, aliasing or going away from a .bank domain to some other top-level domain is currently prohibited.
Great, thank you. So for clarification, it's possible to embed videos or links to social media sites that have a .com root on your .bank website.
That's correct. And again, we strongly recommend that when you're serving up third-party content like that, particularly if you're using your .bank domain, that you provide some warning to participants or to users that they're going from where they were to some other place outside of your bank's website, and to give them the option to either continue or not.
Great, thank you. And we have a follow-up question. For example, embedding a video. I imagine if they embed a video using iframe, they would not need a pop-up alerting that it would be a redirect because they are actually staying on the .bank website itself.
So I'm not familiar with iframe, the product that you just named, but if you're serving up video but it's in your .bank infrastructure, absolutely a pop-up wouldn't be needed. We recommend the pop-up, and we strongly recommend it when you're taking an internet user or a customer from a page on your .bank website to a URL of something outside of .bank.
Okay, and moving on to hosting. Are there any restrictions on hosting providers?
So again, Craig Schwartz, from FTLD's perspective, we merely are responsible for setting the requirements and monitoring for compliance with them. We very much have stayed away from recommending and or developing a list of preferred providers, whether it's hosting or DNS service or other types of products or services you might need to buy. It's really up to the bank to determine who their business relationships are with. And at the end of the day, the bank is the one that's responsible for ensuring compliance with all of the requirements of having a .bank domain.
Great, thank you very much, Craig. I'd also like to move forward to a DMARC question. I assume this would be for you, Rob. Could you please explain what exactly DMARC alignment is and how it differs from a DNS record?
Yeah, so the way that DMARC works, and I'm going to try and not get too technical. The way that DMARC works, somebody asked the question earlier, well, it was you, Andrew, in fact, what's the difference between SPF and DMARC? And I talked about the fact that there are, in an email, there are two from addresses. There's the one on the envelope, and there's the one at the top of the email. And they are two discrete fields of an email. People think they're the same. They're two completely technically discrete fields. The way that DMARC works is that in the first place, it will check that the email passes SPF. So let's say I inspect the envelope of the email, and on the envelope of the email, there's got the envelope from address, and let's say that address is bounce.mybank. Or kind of, let's say bounce.london.bank. Let's say, assuming there's a bank called London. It will check that email has come from an IP address that london.bank allows. DMARC, excuse me a second, DMARC will then check the header from, it'll inspect the email within the envelope, and it'll look at the from address at the top of the email. And if the address at the top of the email came from an address at some other random domain, .com or .bank or anything else, then that would not be in alignment with the envelope address. And so when we talk about DMARC alignment, we talk about alignment that must exist between the email address at the top of the email, what we call the header from, and the email address on the envelope. So having authenticated the envelope, we then check that the header is aligned with it. There are a couple more technical kind of options available to you, one called relaxed and the other called strict. I'm not going to go into those details at this point, but the important thing is that people understand that the alignment check of DMARC ties other authentication methods to the header from, to make sure that what has been authenticated on the envelope is the same as the domain at the top of the email. I will just mention one other thing, because I think Tom alluded to DKIM earlier. There are reasons why SPF can fail in a forwarding situation. If I receive an email at Yahoo Mail, but I've got a forwarding rule to Gmail, Gmail will not see the original sending infrastructure. They will see Yahoo's sending infrastructure, and that can break alignment. So there's a second method of authentication called DKIM, which is a signature-based mechanism. And DMARC will also, as a backup for SPF, check DKIM and check that that passes, and that the domain that signed the email for DKIM is the same as the domain in the header from. So, sorry that was quite a long answer, but what DMARC alignment means is it ties an authenticated identity and makes sure that it's in alignment with the domain of the email address at the top of the email when you open it.
Thank you very much, Rob. That appears to be the last question we have on DMARC. And then finally, we do have one more question to wrap up the presentation. I'll direct this towards you, Craig. Is there any additional information available regarding the .insurance domain name?
Thanks, Andrew. So the short answer to that is not yet, although we are looking to a launch of that probably right around the April 1st timeline. We should soon have some of the registry policies posted on ftld.com, and the process itself will look very much like that for .bank, including the verification piece by Symantec, including the rules and the requirements. So it's a very similar registry, other than the stakeholders it's intended to serve are from a different part of the financial services sector. So we will post information on ftld.com just as soon as it's available, but look till around an April 1st, 2016 launch.
Okay, and we're very much looking forward to that launch. So that will conclude our webinar this afternoon. I would like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Craig Schwartz, Robert Holmes, and Thomas Barrett. I hope everyone has a great day. Take care.
Bye, everybody.